I've worked with professionals who are consistently competent. They're reliable, and still they find themselves wondering why their influence has not increased at the same rate as their effort. This is not uncommon. If you unpack that pattern, you start to see the same capabilities or skills showing up over and over and over again in the people who end up gaining broader trust with leadership and decision makers. They usually influence how decisions are made, how problems are framed, and how responsibility is handled in everyday work. Those capabilities rarely receive attention because they're not usually the flashy kind, but they still determine who is invited into conversations over time. Welcome to Control Your Career. I'm Julia Toothacre, your strategic career consultant, and I'm so glad that you're here. This season is all about career leverage, how your career evolves once credibility is established and you're ready for more strategic positioning. In the last few episodes, we've talked about more of the structural side of leverage. We've talked about the compounding idea and we've talked about where leverage comes from. Today, we're shifting a little bit more inward. We are going to walk through 5 capabilities or skills that consistently influence how much trust you're given and how broadly you're considered for other opportunities. I want you to listen to this episode with a more diagnostic lens. I know some of you are going to go immediately into judgment and say, I don't have this, or this isn't me, this isn't my personality, all of that. I don't want you to do that. Okay. But I do want you to be really honest and truthful about where you stand with these skills and qualities. I want you to get clear about where you are already strong, where you have some of this, and maybe where you need to develop more intentionally, and where does it make sense for you to develop within these different capabilities. Let's get into it. The first skill we are going to start with is judgment. There is a lot of research to support that critical thinking and problem solving is really among one of the most in demand skills across industries in multiple organizations and workplaces. We see that all the time. But problem solving is more than just let me look at the situation and let me come up with different solutions. It's really about the judgment that comes next. So deciding what matters in that decision and deciding what doesn't matter in that decision. And even more important, what to do next if you don't have all of the information, which how many times have we been in situations where we only have part of the information, or we are trying to reconcile what a leader wants and some strategic vision that maybe we don't quite understand, and then what's going on in the market or with our clients and customers, and we have to make a judgment call on what to do. Judgment is really about the ability to make sound decisions under uncertainty, right? Under this guise of, I don't quite know what's going to happen. I maybe don't have all the information, but I need to make a decision and I have to be able to justify that decision. So when you have strong judgment, you really have the ability to look at a situation and understand what needs some kind of escalation and what doesn't. There are certain judgment calls that we can make in our day-to-day lives, regardless of the level of work we're in, that we can say, I can handle this, or maybe I need to bring somebody else into this conversation. You start to weigh the trade-offs in a decision or a situation. And so you might have to make a choice that's going to upset some people, but you understand why you're making the choice and you recognize that it's the best choice. And you have the ability to not bring your emotions into it. I think that's something that really stops a lot of people from really fully stepping into empowerment when it comes to judgment, because they do have emotions attached to things. They do have emotions attached to situations or people. And the ability to take a step back from that and make an informed decision as best you can is really, really strong judgment on your part. And then I think one of the biggest indicators of strong judgment in your career is when people are coming to you and wanting your perspective before they make any type of decision. And I think what's funny here is sometimes you'll get brought in to a situation that maybe has nothing to do with you, but you have proven your judgment over time to be really sound in your ability to think through things a certain way that works for that group or that team, and they want to bring you in to talk through it. I think sometimes this also happens in a behind closed doors situation. So maybe we're just having one on one conversations and we're able to talk through different situations. And so you build that rapport and that trust with somebody, and they want to know what is your judgment call on this? What do you think? How would you handle it? I was in situations back when I worked in higher education where I was called in by some upper leadership to talk about certain scenarios, certain programs, and things like that. The irony to me was I was not leading the office at the time. So I was one of the newest employees, though I had been there for a while, but I had the least amount of experience in this particular field. But because I had been in another area in the university, people understood how I made decisions. They understood how I saw the university as a whole. And so that made my judgment really strong. And so I was brought into conversations that really the leader of my department should have been brought into. But because of my experience and my exposure, my judgment was trusted a little bit better, which did ruffle some feathers, but it ended up being fine at the end of the day. So being known for your judgment is something that I think really elevates your career and creates so much leverage in what you can do next. So what does it look like when that judgment is underdeveloped? What are some of the signs that we're not quite there yet? One is you're going to default to rules. You're going to get really caught up in the rigid rules and policies of something instead of taking a step back and understanding the context and really thinking through what is going on. You might escalate things a little too much. I see this happen a lot in early career professionals because they just don't have the judgment yet. Some do, but not all. And so they tend to escalate more situations than they need to. And in those cases, you really just need to learn how to trust your judgment a little bit more. But the other side of that is sometimes we avoid escalation. So there might be a situation where we do need to bring somebody else in on it, or we need another frame of reference or opinion, and we're not doing that because we think that we need to handle it ourselves. And really, we just need to have the right voices and the right people in the room. And then finally, it looks underdeveloped. Judgment looks underdeveloped when you focus on being technically correct, which a lot of people want to be. But you sacrifice strategy, you sacrifice effectiveness of strategy. And so just because you're doing something and all the technical pieces are falling into place does not mean that the choices made were the best ones strategically. I think we see this a lot in tech happen, but it can happen in other spaces as well. We're doing the job, we're checking off all the boxes, but because we are more of a head down employee, we're not necessarily thinking strategically about how some of these things will impact the broader client or the organization as a whole. And so it's really just being very narrow with your view of the work that you do within the organization. Okay, so what are some ways that we can build judgment? One way internally, so internally meaning within your organization, is making sure that you debrief after projects. So having discussions around what went well, what we could have done different, and getting different voices in on something. This allows you, especially as maybe a newer professional, to look at a situation and understand why decisions were made or the impact that some of these decisions had and what could have been done differently, right? And so it's really understanding those trade-offs that we talked about and what could have been sacrificed to make the project better, and would that have made sense? And I think being able to have the different voices help you understand that, again, helps you build that judgment that you can then use for the next project. And then externally, how can we do this? Well, we can study. We can study what other people have done. I think this is where, if you have an MBA or graduate degree, being able to study different case uses for things, doing some additional research when you start a project, being able to analyze real world decisions and failures and where things have worked, and how much was just timing, how much was connections that this organization had, how much was funding impacting all of this. I think the more that you can understand how your work and your positioning fits in to that, the more you understand that so many use cases that are successful, a lot of times it's something really specific that happened, right place, right time, right funding, all of that. And so then you understand what is within your control and what is outside of your control. The next skill we have to talk about is communication. I know you knew it was going to be in here. I did make it second, and these are not in any order, by the way. These are just in an order that I think is helpful, but there's no priority to them. But I would say I think communication is very high on the list of skills that you need to understand. And I'm saying clear communication because I want to make this broad enough to fit people who are in different places within their career. So communication skills are cited as one of the top factors that influences most professionals' effectiveness and their ability to move forward within their career. We see this all the time. If you look up any skills list, you're going to see communication of some kind at the top. So this is something that you as a professional have to be really aware of. I would hope at this point that you do understand your own communication style and where you excel and where you might have some gaps, but you never know. This might be the first time that you're thinking about it, and that's okay too. So, I think one of the things right now that we have to consider when it comes to communication is that work and positions are becoming more and more complex. A lot of positions way back when used to be very singular. You did a singular thing, and that was the thing. I think now we're asked to do so many different things and step into so many different roles for a lot of positions that we have to be able to communicate. We have to have that communication cross functionally. We have to have that communication up and down the chains of command. We have to be able to be so clear about our communication that people maybe even just say, okay, I get it. You almost want them to say that to you because you are being so clear. And I think the reason that this is so important is that clear communication is going to reduce confusion for other people. So the clearer that you can be in whatever work you're doing, the easier it is for people to understand you. And then that is obviously going to help your leverage because people are going to see you as somebody who can communicate clearly. So I want to give you some examples of what strong communication looks like. This is not a be all end all. These are just some, I think, everyday examples that we can really check on ourselves with that aren't necessarily the bigger, like strategic executive communication. That's a different thing. I just want to go with basic, clear communication. So, one of the base things you can do is anytime that you are running a meeting, it's going to end with defined next steps. I know all of us struggle with meeting management. Not that we struggle with it, but we are in meetings where there is not great meeting management. And I know we've all experienced that at some point in our careers. And so you need to be the person that changes that. You need to be the person that sets the tone of what this looks like. I think it's not just being able to define the next steps at the end of the meeting, but how well are you preparing people for this meeting? Are you sending out appropriate information and documentation ahead of time? So think about that. Think about effectiveness of your communication before and after meetings. And then looking at your writing style, written communication is so huge. And I think that we don't spend enough time talking about it, but your Written communication has to be able to take complexity and make it simple, make it easy for people to understand. And I think a lot of professionals get hung up in the minutia of the work that they do, or they're so good at their thing. I think a lot of individual contributors fall into this. They're very technical, they're very good at their thing, and they struggle with simplifying what they're doing in order to communicate it out. So that is definitely something that you can work on as a professional if that is something that you struggle with. But the ability to do that, I am going to tell you, it changes the game when you're in meetings, when you're presenting information, even when you're just communicating via email. I think this is where AI can actually be really helpful in you writing an email and then allowing it to help you modify and giving it the directive to help with that, or ask you good questions to help simplify it as well. The other time clear communication is really strong is when you are framing decisions around outcomes. So much of what we do in business is outcome driven. And I think when we're thinking leadership and what they're looking for, they want to understand the outcome. So if you can be really clear in the decisions that you are making for whatever you're working on, and you understand how it's going to impact the outcome, I think that really helps the leaders understand, okay, I see why we're doing this. So often we're not able to have that communication of why. We just know that we need to do it. And so being able to take a step back and go, oh no, if I do this, it's going to impact the outcome this way. I think that helps leaders understand your context and your situation. And again, it makes you look like a clear communicator. So, what does communication look like when it's underdeveloped? What are some of the signs of that? Your conversations generate more confusion. So, if you find that in your conversations, people are asking a lot of clarifying questions, then that means that you are not being clear in your communication. Now, not always, sometimes clarifying questions are warranted, but if it's consistent every time you are having meetings, one on ones, all of that, then that tells me that whatever is coming out is not clear enough. And so we want to work on that and make sure that we understand what we're talking about. We're able to make it into something that is clear for the average person. And then over explaining, I think, is something else to look at when you have underdeveloped communication. I see this happen a lot, even from really strong professionals. I think we start to doubt ourselves sometimes, or we doubt what we're doing for whatever reason. Sometimes it's outside of our control, and we've just been given something to communicate that we don't know fully. And we start to over explain to make it seem like we know what we're talking about. But you still, in those situations, need to take a step back, make sure that you're structuring everything in a way that people are going to understand. And again, you can clearly communicate what is going on. I think sometimes it's good to give more simple explanations and allow people to ask questions versus that over explanation that then generates different kinds of questions that still are not great. And then I see this a lot. I see this a lot with leadership, unfortunately, but they assume that people understand what they're saying and they don't check. I see this happen a lot in manager employee relationships. I see this happen a lot with executive leaders that think that they have communicated something really well and nobody understands what they just said. But they think that because they're the big boss, that all is good and we move on to the next thing. And now everybody's really confused. Just because you're in an executive position does not mean that you know how to communicate clearly or that you have clear communication consistently. I think that's something that we can all work on. We all definitely have gaps in our communication in certain contexts. And so understanding what that is only going to help you. But at the end of the day, when you are delivering information, especially if it's something complex, you always want to do a check-in, make sure that people understand, give space for questions, whether that's directly or anonymously, so that there isn't confusion moving forward. A few actions you can take to practice clear communication. when it comes to the work that you do in your organization, practice summarizing meetings. If you can summarize a meeting into 3 to 5 bullet points or action points, then I think you have been really clear. And honestly, if you're not identifying those action points ahead of time, that might also be a gap. So planning meetings well is also something that's going to allow you to communicate clearly. And then externally, if you want to practice communication, specifically written communication, I think anytime that you can publish your thoughts, publish ideas that you have publicly, you start to think about those things in a different way. Because I think about, publishing on LinkedIn, or if you have some type of magazine within your function that you can post in, or an industry publication, something like that, you start to think differently when you know that somebody else outside of your company is going to be reading it. So I think that's really helpful if that's something you're interested in, to just start doing that. Start with LinkedIn. That's the easiest place because people will ask you questions. You can send it to people, get their feedback. And I think that'll help you be able to talk about things in a different way. I highly recommend this for people that have more complex positions, more just detailed work that you have that needs to be explained to average people. I think this is a really great way for you to build those skills. And then our third skill is business awareness. I actually do not see this talked about a lot. And I wanted to add it here because I think when we're talking about leverage, this is a skill set and a capability that gets really, really overlooked, but I think is one of the most helpful for you moving internally within an organization. So if we think about business awareness, this is where you understand how the company functions. Honestly, I think this works really well for somebody that's been in the organization for a while. Maybe you've moved up through different positions. Maybe you've been on different teams. So you have a different view of the organization. I think people who have really strong business awareness, they understand the organization at its core. They understand the mission. They understand the strategic priorities, all of that. Okay. And I feel like for people who want to go into much higher level positions, so I would say director and above, really your C-suite positions, if you do not have this, if you do not have awareness, if you do not have business acumen, you're not going to get there. If you get there, it's an absolute fluke that you got there, because you have to understand how the business functions. You have to understand the industry. Like, there are so many strategic components that you have to understand, that the better you can do that earlier in your career, the easier it's going to be for you, and the easier it's going to be for you to communicate what the business needs. So what does it look like when you have strong business awareness? I've mentioned a few things already, but I want to get even more granular with it. So you have an ability to connect the work that you do to revenue, cost, or risk. And depending on the industry that you're in and the function that you're in, sometimes this can be easier and sometimes it can be harder. But you understand where you fall. You understand the importance. You understand the challenges of your position within the larger organization. I said this before, but you understand strategic priorities. I cannot stress this enough. When your organization does a town hall, a big town hall webinar thing, they put out some kind of strategic priorities PDF, whatever it is. I know a lot of you will balk at it. You won't read it. You won't pay attention. That is going to be to your detriment. If you want to stay in that organization, if you want to move up, you have to understand what the strategic priorities are and how the work you're doing is going to slot into that, and where can you, suggest different opportunities for yourself so that you can be strategically aligned. We've been talking a lot about trade-offs in this episode, and I think this is, again, connects back to the judgment idea. but you understand what trade-offs mean within your function and you can anticipate them. So you can look at a situation and go, oh, this is not ideal. And I can see where I'm going to have to compromise here, but it's going to allow me to do this strategic thing. And what can I do to maybe help this other thing? So you're really able to look at a situation broadly. I think from a leadership perspective, you also know that you can't make everybody happy. Decisions are going to get made that are going to upset people. But you understand the decisions and you understand why you're making those decisions. So, what does business awareness look like when it's underdeveloped? Um, Most simply, you are focused only on your department. Even more simple than that, you're focused on your role, your role, your team. You might not even care about the larger department. But the basic idea is that you are really in a silo and you do not think about what is happening outside of that. That is absolutely to your detriment if you are trying to create leverage in your career. And then another way that it's underdeveloped is you are resisting decisions without understanding what's going on. So I see this happen a lot when organizations undergo some type of change and people push back and push back and push back. They don't like the decisions that were made. They don't like the changes that were made. And instead of understanding why and understanding the broader picture and trying to figure out how to adapt into it, all they do is push back, push back, push back. And this goes back into that judgment skill of your ability to kind of disconnect from your feelings in a way, or you at least acknowledge your feelings and you put them to the side and go, I don't like this. However, I understand why this decision was made. Now, you are not always going to understand why a decision is made, and sometimes it's not a good decision, but you at least can dig into, I know why they made it. I don't think it's a good decision, but I know why they made it. Okay. And again, you're looking at everything from a strategic lens. And then our fourth skill is going to be pattern recognition. This is also something that I do not see talked about a lot. And I think for some people is going to be a stretch of skill. Pattern recognition comes more naturally to certain personalities than it does to others. Doesn't mean that you can't have it. It doesn't mean that it can't be developed. It absolutely can. But the ability to do this easily, it just comes easier to some people than it does to others. Okay. So analytical thinking and pattern recognition, which is a lot of what pattern recognition is, these are some core components to problem solving. You'll see we have a little theme here of things that are connected to problem solving. And this is, again, one of the most valued skills that we see consistently. So a lot of this is taking the broader skill of problem solving, which people think, oh, yeah, I can solve problems. I do that all day. And it's breaking it out into the different components that we see within problem solving and how that's going to impact your career moving forward. Pattern recognition, when you are trying to advance in your career, depending on the organization, I think is a key skill that helps you really move through faster because you're just able to make the connections quicker than other people. Um, Organizations really usually reward people who can anticipate issues before they get to a place where they cannot be managed. And so when you can see the patterns of something and go, this is not going to work out, and I know why, a lot of times that is a skill that people want. Now, I will say some organizations want that skill, but they will not act on it. And so for those of you who have really high levels of pattern recognition, this is going to frustrate you to no end. You are going to be constantly frustrated because you're going to see that something's not going to work out. You are going to tell somebody, you're going to have a good case for it. It's all going to make sense. They're not going to listen to you. They're going to move forward with whatever the initiative is. It's going to fail exactly how you said. And then you're going to be sitting there going, I told you, and I wrote a report about it, and you should have listened to me. And I know that that is a common experience. I have seen that happen. That has happened to me as well. I have really high pattern recognition in organizations. And I'm going to tell you, it can be really rough for somebody that sees that. However, if you get into an organization or you work for somebody that really values that, and they get it, then you will become indispensable. And that is what we are looking for. So sometimes you have these skill sets and they're not being utilized well because you're in the wrong environment. Okay, so what does pattern recognition look like when it's strong, when it's being used well? So you're going to see reoccurring issues across projects. We just talked about that. You're going to see something and you just know that there's a bottleneck somewhere and it keeps happening and it keeps happening. You're able to identify the root cause of something. I think this is a big distinction in the level of pattern recognition that you have. So some people understand what's going on. They see the symptoms of the problem, but to be able to connect everything across and get to the root of the problem, I think that is something that people really like to see because they want to understand where to fix it if they want to fix it. And then I think when you get to a certain point in your career and a certain level of exposure in your career, you have the ability to connect across different teams. So you can see where certain data is going to impact in certain places or where you're going to have like cross-functional crossover and things like that. And so anytime you're in a position to be able to make those connections, and again, sometimes even look at redundancy and how can we pool resources and all of that, I think that is something that whenever you can save money, cost cutting measures, organizations like that, leaders like that, again, not all of them, but a lot of them will appreciate that if you have that lens. So what does it look like when it's underdeveloped? Okay. So pattern recognition, I absolutely believe can be learned as all of these skills can be learned. But again, it's going to come easier to some than others. So for those of you that might have underdeveloped pattern recognition, you're really going to look at problems as isolated incidences. And sometimes they are, but a lot of times there's something bigger going on and you need to make sure that you explore what that looks like. And then also you're constantly fixing the same issue. And it doesn't have to be something big. You know, I think a lot of times we think about these big complex systems that we have in organizations and we need to figure out, you know, this massive complexity. It doesn't even have to be that complex. It could just be something in your day-to-day work that you realize I'm doing the same thing over and over again. How can I do this more efficiently, or what change needs to happen in order for me to do this in a different way so that I don't have to be consistently fixing this. I think so often we just deal with something in our workflow instead of actually fixing it. And that's where pattern recognition, stronger pattern recognition can come into play. And then our final skill is strategic execution. This season is all about strategy. So you had to expect that it was going to be one of the skills that I was going to highlight. This is really bringing everything together. Execution, and specifically strategic execution, it's what translates everything into it's what translates everything into visible results. Okay. And I think this is where in earlier episodes, we talked about execution, execution versus leverage, execution versus strategy, and how earlier in our career, we focus so heavily on execution. Execution doesn't end once we get promoted. We are always executing on something, but when we get to a certain point, it becomes more strategic. So it's less about somebody telling me what to do, and it's more about, is the work I'm doing strategically aligned to the organization, to the team? Do I see all the connections? Is this worth my time? So when we look at strong strategic execution, you're going to prioritize those high impact initiatives. So you're going to be able to look at your scope of work and go, okay, here are all the things I'm expected to do. And here are the things that are going to have the biggest impact. So I'm going to prioritize those and get those done first and make that impact so that I can clearly communicate it out, so that I can show my judgment there, so that I can show my business acumen, right? I think you're able to decline work that really is not focused on those high impact initiatives. So sometimes we get pulled into things that we don't need to be a part of. Sometimes you have to do those things. So it depends on how much leverage you have in your current position, whether or not you're able to say no. But if you do have leverage, you can say no to some extent. But sometimes we just have to do things, right? But when you do have that strong strategic execution, you are able to say no because you're able to justify why it doesn't fit into what you're doing. And then also your execution really reinforces your positioning. And this is kind of what I was talking about earlier. The more leverage you have in your position, the more you understand the positioning that you have on the team, in the organization. And some of you were going to say, I don't have that. I'm so low on the totem pole. You would be surprised. Even my early career clients and students I've had in the past, they have so much more leverage than they think just because they are in that early career. So don't discount that. You can be strategic even in the early phases of your career. You just have to think about it in a different way and then have that open communication with your managers, talk about it. So what does strategic execution look like when it's underdeveloped? You're busy. You're busy. And so you think that the more that I do, the more activity that I have, the more progress I'm making. And that's not true. You're just checking off boxes. You're just keeping yourself busy, but you're not leaning into things that are actually going to move the needle for your position or for your own leverage. All right. And you accept work without thinking about the outcome of it or where it could lead. Again, sometimes we don't have a choice in the work that we accept, but when you have higher leverage, you're able to say, I don't think that this is going to align with the work that I do, and here's why. So you have to be able to build that case, right? Using your judgment, using your clear communication to be able to say, I should not be the one doing this, and here is why. All right. Okay, so we went through all five, and you will see none of these were really flashy, right? These were not really high value skills that we see on all the lists, except for maybe communication, which we see all the time. These are so easy to overlook because they usually just develop over time. They're not really something you consider in formal recognition, but they do influence trust. It influences how much trust you're given in your position. It influences who sees you and how broadly you're considered for different opportunities. And it really shows you at the end of the day, how much influence do you actually hold? And I'm sure for some of you, you're going to be like, I can't do this. I can't do this. Well, then that means that your influence is lower. And so then we have to talk about what does that look like, which is what this whole season is about, your leverage. So as you reflect on what we covered today, remember judgment, communication, business awareness, pattern recognition, and strategic execution. I want you to consider where you are genuinely strong and then where maybe there is some competence, but there isn't evidence to back it up. We want to make sure that we can say, I have this skill and here is why. It is so easy to overestimate these skills. I think that so many people do overestimate them because they are things that we are likely working on every day. They're in that day-to-day work. And so the question is not whether or not you use them. We all use them to some extent. but you have to understand the level that you use them. And so that's what I wanted you to look at today, really that diagnostic lens of where do I fall within these different skill sets. So I hope that you evaluated all of them to some extent. Um, but I would absolutely choose one specifically to dig into a little bit more, really look at it intentionally, pick it apart, create your evidence, all of that. Look at recent decisions you've made, look at conversations you've had, maybe even feedback from a manager that you've gotten recently. Look at the problems that you are known for solving. Why are people coming to you, right? And then be able to look at some of these skills with just a little bit more intentionality and depth. Remember, this is all about clarity. We want you to be more clear. We want you to understand your reality when it comes to these skills. They're already there in some way. They need to be there if they're not fully developed. We do need to get them there. So don't think that you have to change everything all at once. This isn't about that. It's about awareness. And then where can we start building where we don't have as much influence or as much leverage. All right, next episode, we are shifting from internal capabilities and skills to external perceptions. I know some of you are going to love this. We are going to talk about reputation. We're going to talk about how it forms and why it often matters more than people realize. Although I would bet that most of my listeners do understand that it is important, and we are going to pick it apart. So if this episode was useful to you, please subscribe to the show so that you do not miss future episodes. And if you think that somebody would find value in this episode, please send it over to them. We always love to have new listeners on the podcast. As a reminder, I am adding additional resources to the blog post for this episode to allow you to dig a little bit deeper into this topic. So definitely check that out. And I will see you next time. And remember, you control your career.